To think you know Imperial Rome, the empire of legions, marble temples, and Caesars crowned in glory? Well, think again, because the real story of Rome's most infamous empress was so much darker than any history book dares to whisper. A woman who rose from the gutter to the throne, twisting desire into her deadliest weapon. An empress whose private chambers reeked not of incense and roses, but of humiliation rituals so grotesque that senators trembled and scribes refused to record them. A ruler's wife who enslaved her husband with lust, turning the emperor into her puppet, while the empire itself rotted from the inside out. You're about to discover the shocking curiosities about Rome's most perverted empress that make Game of Thrones look like children's theater. From the tavern stages of her youth to the forbidden palace orgies she staged in secret. From her mastery of blackmail, through intimacy, to the blood-soaked revolts her corruption ignited. These are the facts that will change everything you thought you knew about how an empire crumbled. Her body wasn't just her weapon. It was the blueprint for Rome's corruption. And before we uncover the forbidden details, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe, because this is history they never wanted you to hear. 1. The shocking hook, an empire. Built on carnal corruption. Picture this. The marble halls of Rome's imperial palace gleam under torchlight, frescoes of gods and heroes watching silently as whispers echo through the corridors. But behind the golden doors of the Empress's private chambers, what unfolds is no divine spectacle. It is carnality weaponized. The woman who was meant to embody grace and moral authority instead staged intimate rituals so grotesque that even Rome's most jaded senators dared not write them down. They called her the mother of the empire in public, but in private, she was the architect of its corruption. What if I told you the collapse of Rome's dignity, the erosion of its political institutions, and the scandal that left the empire stained in history's memory began not in the Senate, but in her bedroom? Before you hear the forbidden details of these rituals, make sure you stay locked in, because this is the kind of forbidden history they never wanted you to hear. This empress was no passive ruler's wife. She was the puppeteer, turning the emperor into a lovesick servant, controlling him with chains no army could break. Every political reform, every military campaign, every appointment to power passed not through Rome's Senate, but through her bed. She created an empire where desire became law and corruption was sanctified. What the people didn't know was that every scandalous performance she orchestrated wasn't just indulgence, it was strategy. And the strategy was absolute control. 2. A childhood shaped by depravity. To understand how Rome's most perverted empress rose to power, you have to look at the childhood that broke her and then rebuilt her into a predator. Born not into wealth, but into the dark alleys of Rome's entertainment districts, she saw from her earliest years that intimacy wasn't about love. It was about survival. While other children played in courtyards, she was forced to perform before men whose pockets decided whether her family ate. By the age of 9, she was dancing in taverns where drunken senators threw coins at her feet, their eyes lingering far too long on a child. By 12, she was part of the circus acts, scenes of calculated humiliation designed to thrill Rome's appetite for cruelty. These weren't just shows, they were indoctrination. Every laugh, every jeer, every demand from the crowd was a lesson in power dynamics. She learned that her body could be both her prison and her weapon. Instead of breaking under this abuse, she studied it. She memorized which expressions made men spend more, which movements disarmed them, which moments of feigned innocence made them vulnerable. She realized something terrifying. Rome's powerful elite were predictable slaves to desire, and if a child could see it, a grown woman could exploit it. The little girl who should have been protected instead became Rome's most dangerous student, enrolled in the empire's cruelest school, the theater of perversion. And soon, that girl would become an empress whose lessons in humiliation would shape the destiny of an empire. 3. From performer to predator. By her teenage years, the future empress had already discovered the cruelest truth of Roman society. Dignity was reserved for the powerful, and the powerless survived by selling whatever scraps they could. For her, that meant performance, but not the kind you'd find in a theater of tragedy or comedy. These were shows of flesh, designed to titillate the mob and humiliate the performer. The Roman circus, the taverns, and the palace courtyards became her training ground. Each night she performed degrading acts while senators and soldiers alike showered her with coins, mistaking their cruelty for entertainment. But unlike other performers who drowned in shame, she was calculating. She watched how the mighty lost their composure after a cup too many, how generals revealed secrets when their egos were stroked, how senators' hands trembled when their private desires were hinted at in public. The transformation was slow but deliberate. No longer just a girl surviving the crowd's appetite, she was becoming a master of it. Every gesture, every carefully timed word, every calculated look was rehearsed to perfection. She discovered that the body was a weapon sharper than any dagger, and she sharpened hers relentlessly. Her chance came when the aging emperor's entourage visited one of her performances. While others saw a disposable entertainer, he saw something different, an intoxicating mix of beauty and danger. Taken into the palace as a courtesan, she finally escaped the taverns. But what looked like salvation was really her battlefield. She wasn't a rescued victim. She was a predator who had just been placed inside Rome's most vulnerable prey, the imperial court. And once inside, she would begin the most shocking conquest Rome had ever seen. Not through armies or speeches, but through the most forbidden weapon of all, intimate control. 4. The forbidden palace rituals. The Roman palace was no stranger to decadence. Feast tables collapsed under roasted boars and fountains spilled wine. But what this empress introduced was darker, more calculated, and infinitely more perverse. Behind closed doors, the palace became a theater of rituals that blurred the line between religion, performance, and corruption. Witnesses whispered of gatherings where senators, slaves, and courtiers were all forced into elaborate spectacles, half orgy, half humiliation ceremony. She staged scenes where men of power crawled like animals, debased in front of their rivals, while she looked on with a smile sharper than steel. Sometimes animals themselves were part of the display, trained creatures used in ways too grotesque to detail in official histories. These weren't merely acts of indulgence. They were rehearsals of domination. Each ritual gave her more information: who would break first, who had weaknesses, who could be blackmailed. And she recorded it all in her memory, a living ledger of Rome's corruption. Even Rome's jaded elite, men who had seen gladiators die and watched slaves torn apart for sport, were unsettled. Too shameful to record, one chronicler wrote, before promptly hiding the scroll. But the empress didn't care about their shame. Shame was her greatest weapon. She understood something few in Rome dared to admit. Men who pretended to be gods in public could be reduced to groveling beasts in private, and once reduced, they could be owned forever. Every ritual ended the same way, the empress in control, her guests indebted, and Rome itself sinking deeper into her grip. What began in taverns and circuses had now become statecraft. The empire was no longer ruled by senators, soldiers, or emperors. It was ruled by one woman's mastery of perversion. 5. The empress's grip on the emperor. When she entered the palace, she wasn't just another courtesan hoping for comfort. She had a plan. The emperor, weary from years of politics and war, was ripe for her tactics. He had seen rebellions crushed, legions march, and empires expand, but he had never faced a woman who treated desire like a weapon. At first, it was subtle, a smile held too long, a touch withdrawn just before it could satisfy, a conversation that seemed innocent but laced with hidden promise. The emperor began to crave not just her body, but her approval. She knew exactly when to withhold, when to indulge, when to let silence stretch until his pride broke into pleading. Soon, Rome's ruler was no longer commanding her, he was begging her. Meals at the imperial table went cold as he lingered too long in her chambers. Senate decrees waited unsigned because she delayed him with whispered secrets and intoxicating performances. She discovered that every political decision could be redirected through private obsession. The empire's fate was no longer decided in the Senate House, but in her bedroom. Laws bent to her will, appointments shifted according to her favors. Foreign emissaries noticed quickly. If you wanted Rome's emperor to agree to anything, you didn't appeal to his logic or honor. You sought the ear and favor of the Empress who held him prisoner by lust. What made it even more terrifying was her restraint. She never asked for everything at once. She fed his obsession slowly, like a drug, ensuring he could never quit. By the time Rome realized, their emperor was no longer ruler, but slave. 6. Turning intimacy into political blackmail. What she practiced privately with the emperor soon expanded into a new form of governance. She realized that Rome's elite, its senators, generals, and wealthy merchants were just as vulnerable to their appetites as the emperor himself. So she turned the palace into a trap. Lavish banquets were followed by midnight games. Guests were invited into rooms decorated with silken drapes and perfumed lamps, told they were safe in the presence of their empress. And then the spectacles began. Wine loosened tongues, music drowned inhibitions, and within hours, the most powerful men in Rome were compromising themselves in ways that could never survive daylight. She arranged it so that every senator, every military commander, every courtier left her presence with a secret that could destroy them. Some were caught in debauched acts, others confessed forbidden desires, still others were humiliated before rivals. She didn't need spies. The elite willingly exposed themselves to her, thinking it was pleasure. But she wasn't collecting memories. She was collecting weapons. One senator who opposed her reforms suddenly found himself silent after rumors of his private habits spread through the city. A general suspected of plotting rebellion fell on his own sword after she confronted him with the intimate details of a night he thought was forgotten. Merchants who once controlled trade routes surrendered fortunes for her protection. Her blackmail was as sophisticated as Rome's legions were brutal. She didn't just threaten exposure. She dangled it. She whispered in airs that she knew things. That was enough. Paranoia did the rest. Men destroyed themselves rather than risk her revealing the truth. By the end of her first years as Empress, she had created what no legion could conquer. A senate ruled by fear, an army paralyzed by shame, and an emperor addicted to her control. Rome was no longer just corrupt. It was enslaved, not by chains, but by desire. 7. The empire of vice expands. Once she secured the emperor's devotion and the Senate's silence, she turned Rome itself into her stage. What had begun in taverns and circus pits was now institutionalized across the empire. Brothels that once operated in the shadows were suddenly granted licenses, officially sanctioned by imperial decree. Tax collectors no longer demanded gold and grain alone. They demanded tribute from the flesh trade, swelling the treasury with profits from humiliation. The same empire that once boasted of law and order now made its living selling vice. She commissioned pleasure palaces, disguised as entertainment halls, where the wealthiest citizens gathered under the pretense of games and music. In reality, they became temples of corruption, funded by the state, protected by soldiers, and overseen by her hand-picked attendants. There, Rome's most sacred values, discipline, dignity, virtue, were turned into laughing stock. The priests, horrified, whispered that Venus herself would blush at what took place in those chambers. But their protests were useless. The Empress had already corrupted the clergy too, ensuring priests who resisted were exposed or replaced. Ordinary Romans, The bakers, smiths, and farmers watched in disbelief. They saw senators parade mistresses openly, generals purchase slaves not for labor but for spectacle, and public feasts transform into obscene masquerades. But dissent was impossible. Every avenue of power, religious, military, political, was under her control. The empire, once known for its legions and laws, was now known for its depravity, and she smiled because this wasn't chaos, it was strategy. By drowning Rome in indulgence, she ensured no one dared resist. After all, a society addicted to its own corruption cannot fight its corrupter. 8. Enemies eliminated through seduction and scandal. But indulgence alone wasn't enough. Power, she knew, was never safe while rivals still breathed, and so she refined her deadliest weapon: scandal. No dagger, no poison, no assassin's blade was as efficient as her ability to ruin reputations. If a senator whispered against her in the Senate, she didn't send soldiers to his door. She sent performers to spread rumors that he had been seen at her midnight rituals, begging like a dog. If a general questioned her influence, suddenly the city was flooded with whispers of his unnatural appetites. The brilliance of her strategy was its simplicity. No one needed proof. In a city already steeped in corruption, rumor was as lethal as evidence. Rome's citizens were hungry for scandal, and she fed them banquet after banquet. Some enemies she destroyed personally. She would invite a rival into her chambers, offer them wine and comfort, and coax from them their deepest weakness. The next day, their career was finished, their honor shattered, their name dragged through the mud. Others she ruined publicly, parading them into her rituals under the guise of reconciliation, then ensuring their humiliation was witnessed by the very men they sought to impress. Even women of influence weren't safe. Noble ladies who once mocked her low beginnings found their sons and husbands ensnared in her games, their families disgraced overnight. Within months, she had transformed her detractors into cautionary tales. Her reign of scandal was so effective that soon no one dared oppose her. Senators who despised her remained silent. Generals bowed their heads. Merchants offered bribes preemptively. She didn't just rule Rome. She owned it, not with armies, but with shame. Rome had been conquered by barbarians before, but never had it been conquered from within by a single woman who knew the truth. In a corrupt empire, the greatest sword is humiliation. 9. The public revolt against corruption. For years, the empire had groaned under the weight of her corruption. The senators feared her, the generals served her, the emperor adored her, but the people, ordinary Romans crushed by taxes and scandal, seethed with rage. It began as whispers in the marketplaces. Bakers muttered that grain shipments were late because the Empress had diverted funds to her pleasure palaces. Soldiers complained that their pay was short, while the palace drowned in wine and dancers. Mothers spat curses at her name, blaming her for a generation of young men seduced into vice instead of valor. Then came the spark. During a festival, the crowd at the circus erupted, not in cheers for the chariots, but in chants, "Down with the Empress!" The sound rolled through the hippodrome like thunder, shaking the marble pillars. What had once been her playground of humiliation now became her battlefield. Within days, revolt swept the city, fires raged through Rome's streets. Crowds tore down statues of the imperial couple, screaming her name like a curse. "The whore of Rome!" they shouted, hurling stones at her likeness. The air stank of smoke, blood, and fury. The emperor, trembling, begged her to flee. Ships waited in the harbor, ready to carry them to safety, but she refused. Standing tall in her purple robes, she delivered the line that would make her infamous. "Royalty is a fine burial shroud. If the people wanted her blood, she would drown them in their own instead." And so, she gave the order. Imperial troops stormed the hippodrome, trapping tens of thousands of rebels inside the very arena where she once performed for coins. Swords flashed, arrows whistled, screams echoed until they dissolved into silence. By the end of the day, more than 30,000 corpses lay in the dust. The revolt had been crushed, but Rome would never forget the price. 10. Legacy of a corrupt throne. Her reign did not end in that massacre. It was only secured by it. For years afterward, she continued to rule beside the emperor, not as his wife, but as his master. Every decree bore her unseen fingerprints. Every reform carried her scent of manipulation. She institutionalized shame as a political weapon. Blackmail became the empire's true currency. Senators learned to kneel not out of loyalty, but out of terror that their secrets would be revealed. Generals marched not for Rome, but for the Empress who could ruin them with a single whisper. Her death, when it finally came, left a wound that never healed. The emperor collapsed into despair, unable to govern without the woman who had enslaved him. Rome itself faltered, hollowed out by years of corruption. The empire that once prided itself on law and discipline had become a monument to vice and manipulation. And her legacy? It lingered. Historians, terrified of recording the full truth, sanitized her story into fragments, hiding the grotesque rituals behind vague words like decadence and corruption. But whispers endured that one empress had turned Rome's heart into a brothel, that an empire had been run not by senate or sword, but by lust. The most chilling part, her methods outlived her. Generations of rulers learned to govern not by honor, but by secret, not by law, but by scandal. The blueprint she carved, control through shame and intimacy, became the unspoken tradition of corrupt courts across history. She proved a brutal truth. Armies may conquer lands, but one woman with mastery over desire could conquer an empire. And she did, at the cost of Rome's soul. Her name may be buried under centuries of dust, but her shadow still lingers in every tale of corruption, every whisper of scandal, every ruler undone not by war, but by lust.